It has to be said that we've seen now in the last N years, 5 years, 10 years, let's say 10 years, quite a number of eruptions of energy, which are passionate and intense, and to the people who are involved in them, electrifying. And then they spike, and then they, whatever the opposite of spike is, they subside. And we saw this, in fact, with the Obama campaign in '08, which was itself a cause that thrilled many people, especially young people, who let themselves believe that the election of Barack Obama was the end goal. That is to say that it was the deliverance for which they'd long hoped. Then we saw another kind of eruption in the Occupy movement, which was a sort of a turn in focus, often involving people who had voted for Obama, toward outsider activity at a time when there didn't look to be much payoff for normal insider politics. Now we see it again in the Bernie campaign, and we've seen it, in other fashion. This is the great conundrum. Nobody is stupid here. The great conundrum of left-wing politics in our time is how the outside energy does or doesn't become engaged in inside politics, by which I don't mean just backroom dealing, but I mean the work of elections, the work of finding candidates and choosing them and preferring them and striking deals, yes, doing normal politics. Nobody has squared that circle.
Have you been surprised by the success and the stamina of Bernie's campaign,
Yeah.
and the fact that it was possible to run it based on issues that the political mainstream had really thought were beyond contention, the challenging of the basics of neoliberalism, and the tough deal for the blue-collar worker?
I have been surprised at his staying power and at the intensity of the attachment on the part of his core followers, who are largely young. I mean, in the New York primary, I think the only age demographic that went for Bernie was under 30, and they went big for him. But he lost everybody over 30 by considerable margin. So yes, I mean it's always a wondrous thing when there's this outpouring of intense feeling. Again, you're right. I mean the attachment to Bernie as such is less intense than the attachment to Obama as a personage was. But that said, yes, I was surprised, as I'm sure he was.
And what are we to make of Obama's presidency now? We're getting to the end of 8 years. For those who followed his campaign, his early speeches in 2007, 2008, he was always very clear that his candidacy would not be the end point, that it was maybe the end of the beginning, but it was all about civic consciousness and a new form of civic activity. And he was very aware of this. Michael Tomasky says wasn't so much a liberal, but a civic Republican. It could be argued, maybe with the exception of the Occupy movement, that there hasn't been that consciousness and it hasn't been catalysed from within the party. Do you regard the presidency in this sense as having fallen short of expectations?
Not only is that spirit not in the party, but actually, insofar as it had entered into the party in '08, the Obama people essentially disbanded it. They had a 13 million name email list. And for reasons that may have been part legal, partly a matter of the party's suspicion of a quasi-autonomous entity that didn't really belong to the party. I've heard it said that there were also technological obstacles to running that apparatus out of the White House computers, which, if possible, technologically might also have been illegal. For whatever reasons, those who thought the Obama campaign was the harbinger of an ongoing mobilization, like Marshall Gans, a great organizer from the 60s who teaches organizing at Harvard and went to work helping to train the organizing segment of the Obama campaign. As he put it later, Obama decided not to be a transformational president, as seemed to be implicit in the rhetoric that you cited, but rather to be a transactional president. Now, so I would say that Obama was always, there was a constructive ambiguity about Obama. I mean, it was partly in the minds of supporters who fancied that he would be the incarnation of the mobilization. But it was partly in his own nature, I think, if we can speak of such a thing. He was not only a civic Republican, is not only a civic Republican, which I think is sincere. He's also a progressive in the 1 century ago American sense. He's a technocrat. It's not just that he's a wonk by premise. He believes in using government to get big results out of minimal moves. To my mind, I'm not economically sophisticated, but to my mind, the bigger story than nefarious trade deals is the collapse, if that's not too strong a word, of American unions, which if they were strong would be able to keep up wages, to arrange for the transfer of some people who were doing manufacturing work that could be much more cheaply done in China, to service jobs which ought to be able to provide another kind of economic platform.
Do you feel that there is a limit to how progressive the Democratic Party can be in the age of globalization? Is it always going to be a centrist, elitist party?
Yes, there is no doubt a limit. But we don't know, I don't know exactly where it is. There's been such weak pressure from the left that we would have to say, de facto, the limit, we bashed into the limit quite a while ago and got our heads knocked around, blasted. So yeah, I have no doubt that there are limits, and that Wall Street has to be repelled. That campaign finance, as Bernie keeps saying, is essential. I mean, there's a plutocratic base for the Democratic Party, which is a divided party, but it certainly sits heavily on the plutocratic side of the table. They are at the very least capable of veto power against more progressive legislation. So I think the real test will be, if there's a Democrat in the White House, how seriously will they take a union agenda?
We just can see in camera shot the front cover
Sheer coincidence.
of one of your books, very good books on the Occupy movement. It was exhilarating, that moment when it emerged in Wall Street, when it happened in Europe, and there was a real conversation that a whole generation was being made aware of the iniquities of the settlement and were consciously dedicated to changing it. What happened to the Occupy movement? Why did it fail? And does it have a future in the United States?
Well, we're in the future. That is, it was an uprising. It spiked, and like all rapid mobilizations, the decline was just about as rapid as the spike, which says something about the limits of social media by way of inducing a sustained sort of organizational framework. The energy that's released then goes elsewhere. So some of that energy continued into a whole variety of mobilizations, including the Black Lives Matter movement, which was sort of just getting going. Well, originally in New York, it was the movement against the stop and frisk police measures. And then there was a convergence between that sentiment and the post-Ferguson movement. A lot of people in parts of the country who had been in Occupy moved into a variety of other campaigns, campaigns for fossil fuel divestment, campaigns to strengthen local or statewide coalitions that have a sort of a Bernie-esque platform. It always faces this problem, which was right at the heart of the Occupy thing, about how outsider energy makes contact with and and collaborates with the insiders. So for example, in the case of Occupy, there was a lot of support coming from unions for the to build the Occupy infrastructure, but most of the unions shut up about it because they didn't want it to be widely known, because they knew that they'd be trashed by the anarchists. Said, well, no, that's reform politics. We're revolutionary. Um, it was at that time. In fact, even before, right on the brink of Occupy, the National Nurses Union, which is a very militant, small but militant union, had decided to campaign for a financial transaction tax. Now this has been picked up by Bernie, um, and so Occupy was able to piggyback on that sentiment. But and my hope was at the time of Occupy that that sort of the inside movement, including unions like the nurses union, would sort of converge on a charter. I use the British analogy of reforms.
What do you make of Donald Trump's candidacy?
It takes my breath away. It's what it expresses is the continuing presence in American life of a nativist, resentful, make America great again bravado, whose strength is largely, I think, in cultural backlash.
But Thomas Frank would say while there is this nativist sentiment that the liberal middle class media pick up, listen to Donald Trump. He speaks much less about race than he speaks about trade, than he speaks about things that New Deal Democrats used to be able to engage the grassroots in. Do you feel that Trump is getting through to people on the economic issues?
Well, sure. I mean, in the way of a demagogue, he will blast China. Okay, so China, they're doing it to us. That you get a big cheer for that. He thinks Japan. I mean, at one point he thought it was in the '80s, and Japan was crushing us. So yeah, I mean, the right wing populism is a force everywhere. We have a long history of it here, and of course, many of his people are aroused in a kind of fevered way about how the big companies are running offshore and undermining the country and so on. Not the first time that we've seen it. Ross Perot had a similar line of argument in 1992, and ended up with 17% of the vote. So as an independent. So yeah, that's a fixture. I mean, that's in America. We've had that that mood and that movement, at least embryonically, for decades now.
Do you feel that demographically he cannot win? Open Democracy recently published an article called "White Men Can't Trump" that looked closely at the demographics and actually argued that even though Hillary is quite a weak candidate, the numbers just aren't good enough for Trump.
I agree with that. I mean, I've been worried about certain scenarios in which there's a panic, whether because of an economic crash or a terror attack or so on. I think it was striking. My impression was that after the Belgium attacks, which was close enough, sort of culturally, on the news grid, to have evoked a kind of recoil. It didn't seem to work to his benefit.
One of the conversations currently focusing many European minds, and I want to speak with you about this in a moment, is about Syriza and Podemos. But people often ask from Europe about America, can it become any more divided? I remember covering the 2008 election and being shocked and thinking, surely there will have to be a moment of reconciliation, and that was very much what Obama wanted to do. It feels more divided than ever now. Do you think that's going to get worse?
Yes. I think Obama was naive about the prospects of, quote-unquote, reaching across the aisle. The Republican Party is a lunatic party, has been for increasingly over decades. This was a party that whose last attempt at finding a center of gravity was George W. Bush. I mean, need I say more? Um, uh, it's basically it's a Confederacy-based party, supplemented by white working class, principally male, uh, what used to be called Reagan Democrats, angry, right-wing populists, nativist in inclination. And these are also, in general, people who are older. So they're there. They will. Their force. They probably amount to a sort of a sure thing 40% of the American vote. Um, they're not going away, and they have no. What's in it for them to compromise? What's in it for them to decide, for example, that they're completely fantastical when it comes to climate change? I see continuing polarization um, without, it might be have a kinder, gentler veneer at certain times. It's largely driven by the right, which is much more right than the left is left. And it's hard for me to imagine a scenario in which they find their way out of this wilderness. I don't think it's just a problem of globalization. I mean, I think, Clausewitz would look at this configuration in Greece and he'd say, well, let's look at the forces that could be mobilized by by the Troika, and let's look at the forces that would be mobilized by Syriza. I inspect them, I look at the data, and you know what? Syriza's going to lose. This sort of normal political assessment would say, yeah, they had their own, extraordinary mobilization, and but what I don't know what else Tsipras could have done. I sympathize with this project because it's in so many ways a quixotic one. Greece is a country that has been plutocratically dominated forever. Certainly since the war, World War II. It has a corrupt press. It has a corrupt plutocratic class. It had a corrupt left-wing PASOK pre-party, which wrecked the Socialist Party, and they were up against. And they're gonna sort of convince big capital and big European governmental, quasi-governmental apparatus to back off. The New Deal, which is sort of the friendly ghost in the room whenever people talk about putting together victorious coalitions. I mean, let's not forget my colleague Ira Katznelson has written about this very tellingly recently. The New Deal coalition, yes, it included the CIO unions, and yes, it included northern white urban machines, working class bases, immigrant bases, and yes, it included black voters in the North. There were very few black voters in the South. It also included the Dixiecrats. It included the racist, white supremacist South, which was an essential element of their political coalition. And yes, it also was able to stop a whole lot of progressive movement. Put up a wall saying, no, okay, well, we getting something out of this. They got, the Tennessee Valley Authority, they got rural electrification, they got reform programs that were useful to them. But they were able to retard, they were able to stop anti-lynching legislation and so on and so on. And so the civil rights movement, had to be deferred for, let's say, 20 years. But what could there have been a victorious New Deal coalition if Roosevelt had actually fervently defied and consistently defied the white supremacists? I don't think so. It was a devil's bargain. But there are times when the devil is mighty strong, and you better be shrewd. How do you convert outside energy into inside work? How do you manage identity tensions? These are staples. These are givens. These are not just mistakes of the moment. We're talking about identity politics now has a multi-decade tradition. It's installed. It's in place. A country in which major corporations are ready to boycott the state of North Carolina because of this ridiculous bathroom bill. So yeah, no, I think the culture. I mean, yes, I mean, yeah, I mean, we're talking. Did we overturn centuries, millennia of patriarchy? No. I think, by the way, that a good deal of the animus toward Hillary Clinton is indignation, sort of unacknowledged, that a woman could be potentially president of the United States, and so on and so on. But really, we've come a long way, baby, with respect to questions of how people live. The obstacles to, sort of citizenly Republican, smaller Republican politics are so formidable. Just the sheer difficulty of amalgamating the resources to win office, or to accomplish anything when you've won. We have many cities. Most large cities in America are governed by black, Hispanic, female, and gay mayors. What have they been able to accomplish? If you're the mayor of Cleveland, if you're the mayor of Baltimore, if you're the mayor of Detroit, that's a self-answering question. You can sustain the spirit of a bloc, but can you get your hands on the levers of national power? We don't know how to do that. I mean, I think a lot of people want that to happen, but as you say, the map does not show that route. I think, people now, the pundits are talking about it. Is there a path to the nomination for Trump and so on? There's probably a path to the growth, to the more than growth, the even prevalence of a cross-class, economically based, egalitarian, union-strong, culturally advanced majority in America. It probably is such a path, but it's through a lot of brambles and swamps, and if the right leadership is in the right place at the right time, they might see these paths, but it's not automatic. The paths are not self-clearing.